During today's conversation, we will be focusing on youth leadership in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and the need for more representation of this community in education and other youth supporting systems. We're joined today by an amazing group of speakers who will be sharing their experiences and perspectives. And we invite you to share your questions for the panelists to consider. Before we begin, I wanted to just go over a few logistics for today's event. Please ask any general or logistical questions in the chat feature of Zoom. If you're having any technical issues, please forward those to our colleague, John Hernandez, who can help troubleshoot. Please submit any questions for the panelists into the Q&A function. We will be collecting the questions submitted through the Q&A function to forward to the moderator. We are recording the session and we'll share the link to the recording later this week. And if you wish to turn on the closed captioning service, you can click on live transcript at the bottom of your screen. Again, please send John a message if you need help. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Ms. Chi Kim. She is the CEO of Pure Edge, Inc., a Boston-based organization that endeavors to provide strategies to help educators and learners achieve success through focus against environmental influences of social media, peer pressure, personal and community stressors. She was named Chief Executive Officer in March 2018 after serving as Chief Strategy and Operations Officer since 2016. Prior to joining Pure Edge, Inc., she was a California school superintendent. She also served as school principal, teacher, and leadership coach, as well as a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is co-founder of the Teaching Garden program that was adopted by the American Heart Association to support heart health through school gardens. She is mom to 3 wonderful girls and resides in the greater Boston area. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chi.
Thank you, Sophia, so much for that nice introduction, and welcome everyone. Before we get started today for diverse experiences and shared power, I wanted to just acknowledge today's anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and I would be remiss if we didn't open with that and just as a remembrance. I wanted to offer up something that one of my dear friends, Dr. Dina Simmons, has shared via social media on her new endeavor, Liberate Ed. And so I just wanted to take a moment to read a poem by Langston Hughes that she has posted online. Tired, by Langston Hughes. I'm so tired of waiting, aren't you? For the world to become good and beautiful and kind. Let us take a knife and cut the world in two and see what worms are eating at the rind. Dina's new endeavor called Liberated Ed also shares, whenever she posts a poem, there's class reflections and reflection questions. And so I'd love to offer up these 3 questions that she shares with the world as well. Our wounds may never heal from losing George Floyd to senseless violence last year. As we grieve, we invite you to hold your hearts tenderly. We offer you this poem by Langston Hughes and this moment to reflect. How are you recuperating after a year of exhaustion? How are you mending your hurt? What will you do to rest? And what are you doing to help the world, make the world beautiful and kind? And I wanted to start with those words and thoughts from Liberate Ed as we share our roundtable panel with you of another group of extraordinary youth. And I'm going to welcome them as well in just a moment. But I wanted to just take just a few seconds just of quiet and silence, so we could all just sort of collectively inhale. And welcome you to the space. Thank you for allowing me to do that. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce to you our extraordinary panel of young people. I've already told them I'm the oldest one on this panel at 53, and I'm super excited for their youth and their energy and just their passion. So today, as you heard and got introduced to us, Sophia Hala-Chin. She's America's Promise Alliance Youth Board member and rising junior at George Washington University, where she's studying international affairs and economics. And I'd also like to introduce to you Dipshika Muruganathan, and she's a rising graduate student at Columbia University. She has just graduated from American University with a bachelor's degree in international studies, a minor in education studies, and a certificate in community-based research. will be starting her graduate studies in international education development at Teachers College at Columbia University. She is currently a communications intern for America's Promise Alliance. And I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Pitsome Oy. She's an assistant, sorry, I apologize. I have terrible allergies, and so I just want to make sure that I give myself a little bit of, there. Okay, let me just get my breath. Dr. Pitsime Mo'oi is associate professor in the College of Education and co-director of the Center for Asian American Studies at University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Dr. Oi's research focuses on Southeast Asian American educational experiences and family and community engagement. She was the first Lao American refugee to receive her education doctorate from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she is the first tenured Lao American faculty member in a college of education in the United States. I'd also like to introduce to you Elisa Dunn. Elisa is passionate about making workplaces more diverse and inclusive. She currently serves as a diversity consultant for Paradigm Strategy, Inc., a diverse and inclusion strategy firm that partners with leading technology startups and Fortune 500 companies to build stronger, more inclusive organizations. Lisa is a proud member of Diversibility, a community of people with disabilities and the people who support them, on a mission to elevate disability pride together. I'd also like to introduce to you James Kwan. Currently, he serves as a communications specialist at ESP Advisors. Previously, he served as a policy affairs coordinator at the Council of Korean Americans and as a policy analyst at Hawaii Public Policy Advocates. He also volunteers for 2 AAPI nonprofits in his spare time, Dear Asian Youth and Asian Activists. And finally, I'd like to introduce to you Jasmine Yuang. She's a sophomore at Stanford University, majoring in comparative studies in race and ethnicity with a concentration in politics, public policy, and equity. She is a proud first-generation student and daughter of Vietnamese refugees. She co-founded the hashtag Diversify Our Narrative campaign because she feels that discussion of race and identity are essential and hopes to make change in school systems to aid in the fight for a more equitable world. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much. I apologize for my faltering here with the allergy season underway. I just want to start off by saying that it's very rare for me to see these beautiful squares of beautiful Asian faces. Usually we don't get to see just us on a screen, so just welcome, and I just want to acknowledge that. And so thank you for being here with us today. I know this topic today, especially with the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and us just being together collectively in a roundtable, sort of sharing. I wanted to just share, I think just the public pain and the public suffering, right? It's our joy, I think collectively. It's not just one group's or one person's, but I think when we actually take and focus on humanity, our joys, our suffering, and our successes should be celebrated together. And so I want to just acknowledge that point for us as we begin. And I want to just share a little bit of, I think, just the context of why we're here today as well. So there's a wide diversity of AAPI heritage. Just looking at our screen together here, right, it includes family, community influences, and it shapes our identity and how our identities are metabolized in the environments in which we live, and how that affects youth leadership. And Asians constitute roughly 60% of the world's population at 4.5 billion people as of June 2019. And then we actually, collectively, we speak nearly 2,300 living languages across the world. There are 48 countries in Asia and 15 countries that make up the Pacific Islands. And just on this panel alone, we're all so vastly different and have unique heritage lines. So I want to just start by the first question to sort of open this up. How has your own heritage and upbringing shaped your identity, particularly as a young person in today's America? I'd love to start with you, Elisa.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this has a lot to do. Actually, I was reading an article by the founder of Diversibility, the disability awareness platform you mentioned, and she talks about how being an Asian woman with a disability in this country is different from having a disability, but being part of any other racial group or groups. And so one thing that is very poignant is that sense of shame or not wanting to be able to talk more more freely about one's disability or one's struggle, right? To model that kind of, model minority kind of thing where, our parents came here, they worked hard, don't complain, follow the rules. And we're seeing that shift now, especially in the past year or so, when we're like, okay, we're going to actually take up our space and we're going to amplify those voices. So I think that, the heritage has come a long way. And, us here today, we're reshaping what it means to have, a disability or a mental disability as an Asian American, what it means to be politically active as an Asian American. So I'm excited to see, kind of where that heritage goes as well.
Thank you. I'd love to pass it on to James.
Yeah, thank you. So speaking from my experience and my background, I am the son of 2 Korean immigrants, and one of whom served in the US military. And so I think there is this duality of identities that, a lot of Asian American kids, especially if they're second generation onward, have to struggle with either accepting one identity or trying to conform to one identity in order to gain it because they feel rejection from the other. And I think, my apologies, and I think that when we look at how Asian Americans are categorized in the context of our society today, we are not seen as Americans, but we're also not seen as Asians if we were to go to Asia, right? And so growing up in this middle ground, this weird situation, it feels like I haven't really been able to connect with my identity very clearly until I actually went to college, and until I went to a PWI, predominantly white institution. I was able to, I think, appreciate being surrounded by people who had similar experiences that I had, and being around people who, it's just great to be able to connect with people who've had the struggles with, parents perhaps fighting in the past during your childhood, or having a language barrier that you're not able to completely overcome. These are issues that you can't really connect with people unless like they go through the similar experiences you did. So I think that really shaped my identity. It really shaped my worldview, and I'm glad to talk about that later on in this panel.
Thank you. Jasmine, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to make sure I'm still on the right question, it's how did my Asian American identity affect me growing up? Is that accurate? Okay, great. Yeah, so I definitely think that, kind of echoing what James said, I really felt that I was able to find my identity when I entered college. And I think that when I was in high school, especially, I started to understand that there was something going on in terms of racialization of Asian Americans. And that's when I was first introduced to the actual naming of the model minority myth. And I think I had felt that even when I was a kid, feeling kind of the pressures that were put on there, feeling the expectations that people would have of me who weren't necessarily in the Asian American community because I was Asian American, and not really being able to pinpoint that. And so I honestly think that being Asian American has definitely impacted me so much, but I wasn't really able to put a name to what I was feeling until much later. But I also think that it kind of stemmed to in that I am Vietnamese specifically. And so I think that there was also this confusion with the model minority myth in my own head that I wasn't really able to trace or speak about, just in that my family and my community didn't really fit into the model minority myth, right? A lot of us like came as refugees. And so I think it was this strange combination of this idealization of all Asian Americans as these like successful populations weaponized against other communities, specifically Black and Brown communities, but then me also like looking at my own family and thinking, well, we don't fit into that. And so there are a lot of different things that are kind of going on, but I think it ultimately did shape me as a person.
Thank you. Dr. Oy, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to be with the youth because then I feel young again. We joke that Asians don't raisin, right? So that's why. So go and I won't tell you that I'm going to my 30th high school reunion this year. So that's how we don't Asian, right? Don't age. So growing up, I grew up in the 80s. So I'm a child of the 80s. So we had, as what Jasmine spoke so eloquently about, was we had a lot of hostilities when we came over, right? And people not understanding who we are and why we're here. So we dealt with a lot of discrimination. And so for some of our younger audience members who don't see the violence, and so for us, we already saw that violence. That violence was here and enacted on us. And so the refugees coming in right after the 1965 Act, and we came as part of family reunification because my uncle came here. And like James, my uncle, all the men in my life are in the military. So that is a really much a part, a strong part of our identity is the military and the U.S. military action in Southeast Asia. But I didn't have any of that concept, right? I came and I thought I was the all-American girl playing soccer, doing apple picking. I grew up in Vermont, right? So everything in Vermont made me feel like that. But then you would have these comments like, go back to your own country and why do you speak funny? Or what's that you eat, right? So all the things that we see on Fresh Off the Boat, right, in the 1980s. I'm like, that happened to us 10 years earlier. And those are the same things happening to all of our community. So it's the same sort of like, who are you? Where are you really from? And why do you speak English? When I've been here since I was 6. So I would hope that after 27 years in the US school system that I would be able to speak English. But I actually have adults. So I teach in the College of Education and adults telling me, oh, your English is so good. Right. And so even as a child, I'm getting the same stereotypes of either as a perpetual foreigner or this model minority, but the lacking, right? And I think this is what's so important because I had a self-ethnic identity course at Boston College, I was able to say, oh, this is a microaggression. Oh, these are the things that are happening to me. Whereas growing up, I didn't have the words. I just be like, wow, they're really mean. They really don't like us, right? Like, and where's this hate coming from? And so for me now as an adult, I understand why, because we've had long histories of sort of xenophobia, right? Anti-Asian and anti-Chinese sentiment, to now being able to teach that to my son, right? To say, because now as an Asian mother, I'm scared for my mom and my son, because those are the two people who are being targeted in the anti-Asian violence. And so they're experiencing a different type of violence than what I was experiencing as a child. So for me, it's marked by these sort of experience of who am I, and what James says, I'm not enough. I'm not loud enough because I'm loud, right? Because good, proper, loud women would not talk about this, right? I'm not American enough because I look Asian. And then when I go back to Thailand or to visit my cousins in Laos, they're always like, oh, here comes that loud American, right? And so it's just this combination of like, where do we fit in? And I finally have found a place to fit in when I learned that there is an Asian America and there are these people called Asian Americans who live in this duality and don't have quite a sense of who they are because of the hybridity in how society views us. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. Deepshika, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yes, not to be repetitive and of course highlight the fact that we all don't have the same experiences and come from very rich backgrounds, but I can very much relate to James and Jasmine and what they spoke about this identity crisis growing up. I was born in India, but immigrated to the United States with my family when I was less than 1 year old. And so to all of my family in India, there was a teasing of, oh, she, is a complete American. Meanwhile, I grew up in very predominant South Asian communities in New Jersey. And so I felt not American enough. And so there was definitely a sense of, me changing my behaviors to become more white or more American, whatever that meant. And again, not fitting into either box quite right. And, I hear from a lot of people that all children, all preteens and teenagers go through this identity crisis. Everyone is trying to find themselves. And that may be true, but I think for a lot of Asian American and Pacific Islander youth, it's that added knowledge of your family background, your community, your racial and ethnic tension to not really understanding those nuances or differences and kind of being told what you should think about that is an added layer to that identity crisis. And it took me a long time to really feel comfortable in recognizing that those identities, those parts of me didn't need to be siloed or put into these separate boxes. I didn't need to code switch depending if I was with my family versus my friends at school versus my teammates on a sports team. Those were all the same Deepshika. And, you know, I could bring this really rich heritage that I was learning from stories from my mom and grandpa, my Indian classical dance classes, into those spaces with friends who were from different backgrounds, and it could be just as valuable. But it takes a while, and it made me realize that representation isn't necessarily enough, because for a lot of Asian American youth, you can be put in a space and still not feel confident enough or not feel like you've been given the space to be actually vocal about your own background. So it's really interesting having this conversation and seeing these added layers that a lot of Asian Americans face on top of the already, you know, issues, nuances, and things that regular teenagers and youth have to go through.
Yeah, thank you. I think all of the stories that you've shared just about your own backgrounds, and I'm an immigrant, so I came to the United States when I was 3 years old, and my family were very, my mother in particular wanted to make sure that, you know, we assimilated. And so it was very clear she didn't want us to have an accent. We actually did not even sort of interact with the Korean community. And I grew up in Southern California. It's hard not to be around Asians in South LA, just so you know. But I think one of the things that, you know, she was very clear, she didn't want us to stand out, put your head down, work hard, all the things that you had shared. There were 3 words that sort of came up, and my aunt, the way we got into the United States is my aunt actually married someone in the US Army. And so when they came back to the United States, they sponsored our family to come. But you used 2 words, shame. So I heard the military, so that sort of resonated with me. The word shame came up very early on when Elisa was talking about just being Asian with a disability. I think, and just around our family heritage of what, you know, the expression of love or the lack of expression of love, but knowing that they loved us, right? So there's this sort of unspoken love, and it came in the form of, you know, do good, you know, did you eat? It's always around food and sort of, you know, in that piece. And there's all these stereotypes that I think you've all sort of overcome. I'm 53, and I have actually just now, as a 53-year-old woman, have joined an affinity group, right? I've never been a part of one. And I think, I know, yeah, thanks to Lisa for the claps. And the reason I share that with you is because I think, one, just to acknowledge the fact that you on this panel, you give me such great hope, that you have the courage to start thinking about who you are so early. And I didn't really have that opportunity. And I'm just so grateful. I feel like the energy and passion that you bring is just really tremendous. And I think Dr. Oy, being a college professor, really being able to teach the next generation is pretty exciting as well. But I want to kind of go into a couple of things that you touched on about prejudice and stereotypes. You know, despite our unique stories in the US, our community is often described under one label as Asian American, right? And or Pacific Islander, so AAPI. So in 1968, for those of you who don't know, the University of California, Berkeley graduate student Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka coined the term Asian American and helped shape decades of advocacy. Times have changed, and in many ways. We live in a very different world from the 60s. And in what ways do you see the making of this monolith harmful and reinforcing the model minority, which you sort of touched on, the model minority myth, disingenuous to the rich diversity of our community? Or have you seen and experienced ways in which this has actually been helpful in bringing together several different groups and eliminating divisiveness? It's kind of a big question, but I'd love to just have you hear that for a minute and think about, you know, how that resonates with you. And I'm going to go ahead and just let you sort of start. Elisa, if you want to jump in with this first question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think people have heard me say before, I'm a glass half full person. And Chi, you mentioned how diverse, even just on this panel that we are, we span so many languages and so many different cultural heritages. But in that sense, being a glass half full person, even with the horrific crimes against Asian Americans that unfortunately are getting increasingly prevalent, I do see the silver lining, which is the unification of the diversity, even within the Asian American, just being able to band together. I think growing up, I always saw, for example, I am Asian, not speaking to PWI people, I'm predominantly Taiwanese, Chinese American. So I would see someone as, Filipino as different from me, or as Indian as different from me. But what has come to light is that others in America do not see us as different, right? So they can't distinguish our different cultural heritages. They can't distinguish our different lineages. And so I've been having a lot of conversations is, yes, we're different. And that's awesome, by the way. But others in America don't see us as different. And for that reason, we do need to band together. They are attacking, Thai Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans. It's just spanning the entire AAPI community. And for that reason, we need to wield our power even despite our differences. The other thing I do love about just having such a diverse AAPI group is, one, acknowledging our differences. I think when we do DEI training, so much of it is taking that time to listen and learn from your mistakes too. And so what I love, even just being on this panel, is learning about James's experiences, learning about Chi's experience. It's so different, but in that way, I really do see that our differences can make us stronger.
Thank you. And speaking of James, did you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, that was very well said. I was going to touch upon the point of how banding together as a collective can help us bring a political voice to the table. And historically speaking, the Asian community, of course, the AAPI community is not a monolith. And if you look at voting records across different ethnic groups, voting patterns change depending on, certain country of origin that you look at. But in this current political climate and in this current, state of society where someone who looks like they might just be Asian passing, it doesn't even matter if they're Asian, some people of Hispanic or Latinx origins have also been getting attacked because they look Asian presenting. And the fact of the matter is that a racist person isn't going to be able to differentiate between all of these different ethnicities. And so I do think it's important to band together in that sense. Where I think that the API label could use a little bit of a refresher would be that when we look at data, especially when we're taking into account grants or federal funding or data that impacts the API community, what we have to realize too is that because the API community is so huge and the PI part of API is oftentimes left out, right? Growing up in Hawaii, I live with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And I'm exposed to them at a much higher rate than other people, I think, around our nation. And the fact that they're kind of being lumped into, the rest of the Asian community when some of these communities are underserved, it, I think, is a disservice to them in terms of a lot of things. And even within the Asian community as well, if you look at different breakdowns of the of, for example, wealth accumulation from different ethnicities, the income gap within the Asian community is much, much, much greater than most people assume, right? And so there are benefits to, I think, banding together as a collective, especially in this current climate where we need to do all we can to stop against these racist attacks that have been happening. But I also think that we should be more intentional with language, and we should also be very intentional, especially when we celebrate API Heritage Month, to be very inclusive of Pacific Islander community, as well as be mindful of Asian American community is not just East Asian, it's Southeast Asian, it's South Asian, it's West Asian, it's Central Asia. It's everything included within that continent, right? So yeah, that's my point.
Thank you. And Jasmine, I wanted to just go back with you to talk about this. You had mentioned the model minority piece. Could you sort of expand on that as we're talking about this particular question in this topic?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that in terms of the broad term Asian American, it definitely does have so many different cultures and different ethnicities within it. And that can be a difficult conversation, as we've witnessed just now. But in terms of the model minority myth, yeah, I think that that is especially something that needs to be discussed when looking at this overall Asian American label as a whole. Just in that, as James said, you know, Pacific Islander communities, Native Indigenous communities in Hawaii specifically as well, like are being affected by things such as COVID at rates that are very different from, let's say, East Asians. And I've done a lot of advocacy too in regards to the Southeast Asian community with the disaggregation of data in universities, actually. And so I actually did a research project regarding Stanford, which is my university, on the lack of disaggregation of East and Southeast Asian data, and how basically a lot of groups, for example, the Hmong population at Stanford, I think there's only about 11 Hmong students in the entire university, but then they don't really get the necessary resources or aid in terms of recruitment because they're put under the larger label Asian American. And so because we have a very strong East Asian presence, they don't see the need to put funding or time into that. And so the university actually made a change of promise actually just this year through their IDEAL program, which stands for like inclusion, diversity, equity, so on and so forth, where they're actually going to disaggregate that data. And so I think that kind of going back to Elisa's point, I see the importance of that collective liberation and that just looking back at the roots of where it came from, right? I mean, I think that the concept of race is very much a concept, and it's something that is not necessarily defined by phenotype or anything like that. It's kind of just this construct that's utilized to, I guess, create groups that face oppression under white supremacy. And so what Asian American culture really is, to me at least, I definitely think there's so many definitions for what that could be. But to me, it's kind of like a shared solidarity in resistance to white supremacy, and having come from just being kind of grouped together, because ultimately it's the state that kind of pushed everyone together, calling us quote unquote Orientals, and we reclaimed it, said we're Asian American. But it was the white supremacist state that originally said, you know, we are going to be this one monolith. But what makes the culture is the resistance against that monolith, and in terms of the way that we're being perceived. So definitely a super nuanced question, but I think that there's both, you know, this power and solidarity within the larger Asian American label, but it's also necessary that the community speaks amongst itself and tries to understand the importance of disaggregation in many ways when looking at the inequities that some parts of the Asian community face and that others don't.
I think if there were a little fire emoji, Jasmine, I would have been hitting that click right up at the top, right? Fire, fire, fire. That was fantastic. So thank you for that. And that's what I mean about the passion, right? So just so early, and I love it. Sophia, I would love to hear from you, just to, you know, build on her fire. I'm sure you've got a little fire of your own too.
Yeah, of course. I would say that going back to James's point about how we're talking about language in prejudice, stereotypes, and racism, I think especially during this time, it's important to make sure we're not diluting language when talking about hate crimes and racism, but the importance of needing to be accurate, because a lot of the discrimination Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were experiencing during this COVID pandemic was centered around calling it xenophobic hate crimes, but that's not necessarily accurate because we're not foreigners. Why are you assuming that we're all foreigners? Call it racism, and don't necessarily call it anti-Asian sentiment, because I don't see any sentiment going on there. It's Asian hate, right? So I think that that's definitely something important to say, and not make it sound all warm and fuzzy and be that sort of Asian that feels the need to work twice as hard to make everyone like us and feel appreciated by American white society, you know? And I definitely see how that's represented in myself, because I think I'm the only mixed race panelist here today, but I am half white and half Chinese. But it's definitely a very interesting mix in terms of my own identity, because my mom, who is white, she was an immigrant. She wasn't born here, but my dad, who is Asian, was. So I almost feel like I attribute more of my identity to the Asian side, because a lot of Asians are put into the box that we're foreigners. So I have the Asian side and the immigrant side, but where's the American side really, you know? So it's definitely hard to see all these stereotypes and prejudice attributed to Asians, but not being fully Asian. I don't have the depth in my own experiences to talk about that as eloquently as everyone else, but I do like to be an ally from the mixed race box of the AAPI community.
Sophia, I don't want you to downplay how eloquent you actually are. So let's just check that box. Deepshika, I would love for you to share with the group a story that you had shared with us sort of in the pre-roundtable about what happened to you in high school, speaking of stereotypes and racism.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from the other panelists as well is also a sense of this generalization of our community and the sort of harm that that can create as well. And that can also come in subtle forms of trying to be better about inclusion of Asian American voices. And so I had this experience my senior year of high school where I was invited by a administrator in the school district alongside another adult to talk to elementary school teachers in our school district during summer professional development about the South Asian student experience. And I was excited to, finally have that platform to speak to all these teachers. I thought it was a great opportunity. I really still applaud my district for making that move after seeing this growth in our population over the past 10 years in our school district. But walking away from that conversation, hearing questions that surprised me about food or parental obligations or expectations, it was expected, but it was a bit overwhelming to feel like I, as a single student, should have to shoulder the burden of teaching everyone, all adults in the room, about the South Asian experience. Especially when, I went back home and was talking to my mom about it. She's like, you don't even have the same like stereotypical experience as other South Asians. We were chill parents, like you did sports. And we're not going to get into the stereotypes around that itself. But, I think it goes back to what a lot of Asian American youth face, and finding this weird balance of wanting to have a space to vocalize their experiences and feel comfortable to share more about themselves and their background, while also not being given the whole responsibility of being the only voice to vocalize all of the experiences across, the whole continent of what constitutes Asians. And I think that's, definitely a space in which there needs to be a bit more training and development of these trainings, or whether it be through textbooks or curriculums or other ways in the education space, that burden should no longer just be solely held by the students themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, we've always been taught sort of like assume the best of intent. And when we show up and we assume best intent, and then it's just exhausting, right? It is exhausting to assume best intent all the time. But thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Oy, I know, you are like, come on, like, look, listen to these incredible young leaders. I'm just so impressed. But I wanted to hear from you, just because you have the historical context. And I think you being the first professor, and I mean, just so many firsts for you, but we'd love to just hear from you about what your experience has been like, and just to add to this conversation as well.
Yes, I'm so humbled, and I wish that you all would choose education as your profession, because you're dropping so much knowledge here. And right, Deepshika, you were dropping knowledge as a high school student, so you've already got your practice in, right? So the fact that our high school or elementary teachers are turning to their children speaks to a lot about the lack of information, the lack of curriculum, and the constant invisibility and erasure of Asian Americans, right? And so that's why they don't know it. And so they're going to turn to people who live it, right? And so that's the unfortunate part, but that's also the potential. California has now enacted an ethnic studies requirement, right? Because they see that when we had Jasmine was talking about the Hmong students committing suicide because of a disconnect, because of the mental health issues, right? So glad having Alyssa here talking about disabilities. Mental health among the Asian American community, it's the #1 killer for Asian females, But do we hear about that? Do we talk about that? Or hepatitis B, the hepatitis B rate in the United States, 50% of them are Asian. So there's so much to be learned from our Asian community, even the origins of the United States. When I talk about why America was founded, it was because Marco Polo went to Asia, exotic Asia, and found all of these spices and furs, right? And so other colonizers says, yes, we want a piece of that action. And so when Columbus sails the ocean blue, he lands in Dominican Republic and thinks he's in India. He thinks he's where Dipchika and her South Asian continent is, right? And so that was the origins of the United States, right? The fascination with Asia. So we have always been in the minds of the United States and its creation, right on to when the first Filipinos stepped foot in 1587, like 1587, right? So when you talk about multi-generations, the Filipinos should have one of the strongest American identities because they have touched the American soil, right? But we are on stolen ground, right? This is what Jasmine was talking about, is about the genocide of the white supremacists. When they came over here, they said, these people don't belong here. We're going to take over. We're going to murder them, right? Then we're going to create a racialized capitalism model that will enslave people. And then we'll advertise that we need more workers because we need a wedge because these white workers are now demanding more money. So then brings in our Asian workers, our Chinese, our Indian, our right. And so this is this whole sort of like racial context of the United States. And this is how we are part of this fabric, but we create and help build the United States, but we are not given the contributions, nor are we given the space because we have the laws that says you don't belong, right? We have the laws where it stopped immigration for the Chinese for 60 years. So there's a reason why there's only 6% of us in the United States, even though we make, like Chi was saying, 60% of the world's population. That's part of white supremacy. So when you have all of this richness, and then we don't have that knowledge passed on to our K-12 system, and if you're lucky, you're in college and you get to take an Asian American Studies course, and you are lucky if you get this identity and you get this history. And so that's why it's hard for our young people to have a sense of belonging. Why did they feel like maybe they're right? Maybe they think I am a perpetual foreigner because I have family who are then. Or when are we going to be enough is the question too. Like for Sophia, whose parents are American, for any child who is like my son, who is born in Boston, when will he be enough of an American or enough of Asian? We have a 1% drop rule for our African American community, but what's the rule for Chinese? What's the rule for Tongans, for Filipinos, for right, all of these different, and that's the question for us is like, when we can take this identity and say, we are already enough. You guys are brilliant, right? You guys that know more than the majority of the teachers in our K-12 system and in our college, right? But what does that say when people who lived through this experience know more than the people who are teaching US history, who are teaching and in the school system? Because our students, our young kids are internalizing the oppression, right? And they're saying, I'm not enough. I'm not American enough. I'm not, Asian enough. And so that's part of what I feel that it is a charge for us, that I would love for you to have more of this, more education. And then it behooves anyone else who works with our young people to say, I'm not going to ask you to teach me. I'm going to go do that work myself, right? Hello, we have Google. Hello, we have all of this remote teaching and learning that is accessible at your fingertips, more so than when we were in high school, right? So why is it that you are depending on your students to teach you? Why can't you take that extra step and read any of the multiple books? We have a whole discipline called Asian American Studies that could teach you. We have timelines, we have PBS documentaries like Ancestors, right? That there's so much information out there that I would like for people to take the time to learn about us and not depend on our young people to educate you because they're too busy being fabulous and leading the charge around racial justice. So let's not take their energies away from the hard fight and put the onus on our adults to do some of that work.
All right, Dr. Oy, you get that fire emoji too. I'm telling you right now. It's so good. Just before we leave you, Dr. Oy, I would love for you to just share just very quickly the data. You talk about representation in education. We're going to go right into, how we see ourselves represented in the teachers who teach us. Right? Representation goes a long way, and people feel as though they have a voice if they feel heard, if they are represented in all different spaces. How have you seen yourself or your community represented or underrepresented in school and other youth supporting spaces? And specifically, Dr. Oy, if you could just kick us off with just some of the stats about the AAPI community in education, that would be great. And then I'm going to toss it to James right after.
Unfortunately, we make less than 1% of the teaching force nationwide, right? And so, but think about all of your Westminster, right? Twin Cities, Seattle, all of the pockets where you have large population. Here in Lowell, Massachusetts, Lowell High School has 4,000 students. 1,000 of those 4,000 or 25% are Asian. But we do not have 25% Asian teachers. So there are less than 1% of us in the teaching field nationwide. And then they might be like 9% in some areas, depending on the outreach and advocacy to diversify the teaching field.
Thank you. James?
So my older sister actually is a teacher currently, and she's doing Teach for America. But the school that she's currently teaching in is in a largely minority community, and they don't have any exposure to anyone who is Asian or anyone who looks Asian. And so to many of them, that's like their first encounter with an Asian person. And, a lot of times my sister has to explain, her identity and like who she is. But I think that just shows more of the fault of exposure to Asian Americans within our education system and our textbooks and our history, and the fact that we're not teaching them enough. Deepshika, you brought up a really important point of, I think, tokenization and how so many Asian students are tokenized by their teachers, especially when, my major was international relations in college. And so whenever there was a question that was asked about Korea or about East Asia, instinctively, they want to ask you for your opinion. And for me, I was never born in Korea. I have relatives there, but I don't go there often enough where I have like that tie to the country. And so in some ways, I think there was a point brought up about how it gets tiring to assume good intentions. And after a while, even though they mean well, trying to do that, it is a harmful act at the end of the day. And so ultimately, I think what really needs to happen, especially in light of the current state of our society, is that descriptive representation, but also more, we need a more robust education system that really emphasizes our lived experiences and the real Asian American history that has been ignored for so long. Like in this past year alone, hearing about all these incidents and having people try to bring up Asian American contributions to American society, I've learned so many things that I have not learned before. And it's so upsetting that it took us trying to prove once again, our Americanness to unearth some of the accomplishments and the successes of our community. And so that's that.
Thank you. Hey, Jasmine, can you tell us a little bit about, I know you're in the K-12 space with Diversify Our Narrative. Can you share with us a little bit about the org and how that started?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I started a organization with my really good friend, Caitlin Zhao, and we're both Stanford students, but we've known each other since high school. We did political clubs together in high school. Last year, during the peak of Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020, so we've only been around for a little under a year now. Our 1 year anniversary is in 3 weeks, but our organization is very young. And so basically what we do is we work with high school students to teach them how to have difficult conversations about race and anti-racism in their classrooms. And so we actually release guides and have training sessions and workshops to have high schoolers essentially talk to not only their teachers, but their school boards to pass mandates that would ensure that one book by and about a person of color is in every English and history classroom. And so since then, we've had about 12 mandates passed. So that's 12 school districts and around like maybe like 7 to 10 schools in each district. So like a couple hundred schools have been affected by these policies that have been really great. And so I think what we were trying to do was channel the energy that a lot of students had towards being anti-racist into like something that specifically leveraged their positions as students. And I think that's something that we noticed that was going on a lot with social media was high schoolers basically saying like, I want to join this effort, but I'm 15, so I can't donate because I don't really have money. I'm 15. I don't have a job. And I can't, go to a protest maybe because I'm also 15. It's like, that's not something I can, but what can I do as a student? And so we were like, well, you actually are in a very unique position in which you can alter your school systems. You can demand that your history be taught. And so even now we're actually doing work with Assembly Member Jose Medina in California to try and pass a bill called AB 101. And this would mandate that ethnic studies be a required course for every high school student in California to graduate, similarly to the way that 4 years of English are required. You would have to learn ethnic studies in some shape or form. So that's currently what we are doing.
I can't believe you just launched that. It's it's only been less than a year. Congratulations. It's so exciting. And hopefully folks who are joining this roundtable will learn from your experience as well. Just sort of tossing it over to the other young leaders here. I know we're short on time, but I'd love to just ask for you right now in this crazy, period of time that we're living in, coming out of COVID, we're hoping, with vaccinations and everything, the world is going to open back up, but we want a new and improved world, right? I think that's really what our collective challenge is, to focus on our collective humanity. What gives you hope during this time? And what specific actions can each of us take to show up for our AAPI community and support cross-cultural solidarity? I feel like we're really sort of in that nice sort of space, right? So this is going to be tossed over. Any of the young leaders, I know Jasmine just sort of lit a fire under my belly about how you can enact change very swiftly, even at 15, right? Or the age groups that you're working with right now, Jasmine. It's great. Who'd like to go in?
I'll start. Is that what gives me hope is that companies are changing. So my company just put out a report. Over 60% of employees that were polled in this study want and expect their employers and organizations to talk about, like put out a statement for BLM, put out a statement against AAPI hate. So that's something that increasingly is an expectation of company employees. So companies are now like having that pressure internally. The second thing that gives me hope is that, for our work, we do a lot of diversity trainings for, different companies, from startups to Fortune 500 companies. And, around last year, this time, they were asking for the unconscious bias workshop. So saying like, okay, let's educate our employees as to what unconscious bias is, how we all have them, that bias even exists and that we all have it. But now we're increasingly seeing that clients and companies are asking for inclusive leadership or inclusive culture workshops. So it's almost as if they fast forwarded a year and they're like, okay, now we know we have bias. We know we have problems. How do we start to create a more inclusive workplace? So that step, it's like, for some of them, they've been able to skip that step within their company because now they're just aware and cognizant that they have work to do. Whereas in the past, it might have been like, do we have work to do? Our culture is kind of okay. We're inclusive, right? And now they're seeing that need. So I see a lot of positive change across sectors in America, and I'm pretty hopeful that we'll continue to see that change.
Thank you. Yeah, going beyond the statements and performative, going straight into changes, right, in work. What about you, Deepshika?
Yeah, I find hope kind of in two altering paths. One being for me just personally within my community, not all of this has to do just with externally what work needs to be done, but even just the conversations we have within our community and family and neighborhood groups, whatever it may be. Over the past year, due to COVID, I was home last semester and was engaged in a lot of these tough conversations with my parents, with other family members and community members who otherwise may have changed the channel or looked the other way because, you protect yourself, you do what you got to do to keep on going. And I think having those tough conversations and now seeing them being the ones reaching out, having those tough conversations without my aid and starting that conversation within their own circles is really inspiring to see that, you know, young youth, we like to joke that, oh, like old people can't change, but there is hope there. There's no end to learning, no matter the age. And no matter those generational differences. So that's a place where I find a lot of hope. And then I also find a lot of hope just, you know, in an event like this and being able to learn so much from my other panelists here, and continuing to see initiatives like Jasmine's and all the work that James does as well, happening and continuing to happen from younger people too. I see younger students from my high school posting on their social media pages about movements that may not necessarily have to do specifically with their community. And I think that's really powerful and strong to see this solidarity being built up, because, you know, oppression doesn't care what you look like. Oppression affects us all. So any positive movement towards any minority or marginalized group is a benefit to us all. So I'm really having a lot of hope for the solidarity that I'm seeing.
Thank you. Sophia?
Yeah, I think like Deepshika and Jasmine and James were saying, we can have those tough conversations, but also it shouldn't be up to the young people to be the educators in the room. We can be the educators if we want to go into teaching, but I think the change really does need to start in the schools, and that's where it starts in the curriculum. I served for a year on the Connecticut State Board of Education, where I actually worked on the ethnic studies curriculum that was passed and introduced as the first in the nation. And it was a really great experience to be able to push for that sort of change, but it wasn't even necessarily focused on the AAPI community, right? It was the Black and Latinx curriculum, which is definitely very necessary, but let's think about what kind of curriculum revolves around the AAPI community. Well, it's ancient China, it's imperialism from Japan, or Britain colonizing India. You know, it's that sort of thing that doesn't exactly help with not reinforcing stereotypes and prejudice. So I think that we really do need to start at the schools. And if we change the curriculum, then it sort of helps shape the way young people are thinking. So when they move out into the world and they go into looking for jobs or become employers themselves, they're way more open-minded and aware of what kind of stigmas they're propagating and all those sort of things that really make a better community for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Thank you. I know, I want to just do a time check. I know we're at 4:28. Do you all have about 7 more minutes just to stick around, just to answer one more question? I think it's super important, the reason why we're here. Does that work for you all? Great. I know that, and for the audience, I know, folks, if you have to leave, we are open, you know, obviously you're free to go. We don't want to keep you here, but we just wanted to ask, because these young leaders, these youth leaders are doing some pretty powerful work. And one of the things I would be remiss not to bring this to the audience's attention and for you to be able to share. I know right now youth leaders from the API community are building bridges with peers and other youth leaders of color, dismantling systems of oppression and discrimination that benefits all. In what ways have you seen or experienced or led yourself the collaboration and solidarity of the AAPI community alongside with other communities of color? And before we get to that, I just want to share one thing that I think is super important for me to just acknowledge for you, is that I think, you know, just having these allyships, right? We talked about education, and right now in the ether for the last 2 years, the AAPI community has been actually used as the wedge community against other communities, whether it's for, you know, testing schools, whether it's for, you know, I do believe the community is being used. We are specifically being used to have these lawsuits against Harvard or these other high testing rates for high schools. But that's sort of how the community can be manipulated in certain ways. But I want to know from you all, you know, that we're not going to be used as wedges, right? For others to be using against us. How can we be allies for other people of color and other leaders of color. And I know you've been working on that. So we'd love to hear from you just very briefly about what your work is. And I'm going to let any one of you just kick it off.
I'll be happy to kick it off. I think the first thing is to acknowledge that there's a long history of solidarity with the AAPI community and with other communities of color. And the fact that this solidarity, I think someone mentioned in the chat that, it's not just API studies, but cross-cultural solidarity that's really important of teaching that in our classrooms. I've had some people come up to me during, when I posted about Stop Asian Hate, and they would say, why, where have you been for this cause or this particular group? And I say to them, there has been this very long and entrenched history of solidarity. It's just not being taught. So I always do my best to show that this solidarity is not new. It's always been there. We just need to elevate these voices, and we need to show up for people, right? Whether that's at protests, whether that's just signing petitions, we just need to make our presence known and not be that community that is not seen and that's perpetually invisible, right? And so I think that's the first step to aiding that solidarity.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna add on to that. Yeah, I really agree with what James said in terms of like that almost transactional attitude towards activism and how that's very harmful. And so I actually had a conversation with my mentor last week, who's actually here right now. It's Shirley. Hi, Shirley. About the like transactional nature of things and like why that's so harmful. And so I think that it definitely is so important to talk about those past histories in which different racial groups have gone out and supported one another. But I also think that it's really important to, even like regardless of that, like there is kind of just that feeling of, people are hurting, and as part of just the larger community of being people or being Americans, like you should not want to see your fellow Americans suffer. And I know that that's like a difficult narrative, just in that America is very deeply entrenched in these capitalistic beliefs, right? And everything kind of is transactional. People are their labor. I know Lowell High School was mentioned earlier, and I actually just like watched a bit of a documentary that came out called Try Harder. That was about the stresses of getting into college as Asian Americans, being dismissed as Asian Americans because of the model minority myth in college admissions processes and all those different things. And something that kind of came up was like the commodification of Asian Americans specifically being seen as, oh, well, they are the model minority because they provide this labor, because they are, getting these educations, they are contributing to the workforce, they're rich, they're successful. That's why they are the model minority. It's very looped into that capitalistic belief of people are what they produce. And I think that that's why it's so hard for people to kind of internalize why that whole transaction of, I stand up for you, you stand up for me. It really is just like, are we not one community that wants to ensure that there is as little suffering among ourselves as possible? And why does there need to be a transaction behind this? And so I think those are just some of my thoughts in terms of what solidarity should look like and where it should derive from.
Thank you. Deepshika or Sophia? Oh, Sophia.
Oh, yeah, I would just add on to that. I think that was just a really great way to put that, Jasmine. And just going off of that, I think that we're seeing almost solidarity through the whole POC community in the United States, but also we're seeing that we're all sort of lumped together as people who are being prejudiced or discriminated against. Something that comes to mind is the Oakland mayor in California was blaming the targeting of Asian American communities by, this is a result of defunding the police, or this is the result of budget cuts happening because this is what you guys wanted, or something like that. And I think that that's just such a harmful way to put that, and also just not true, right? And just going off of what Jasmine was saying about how we are the model minority and we get stuff done, but that's also something that's mostly attributed to Asian immigrants, right? Because a lot of the Asian Americans that were born here, they're not necessarily all rich. A lot of them are very poor and have low rates of high school graduation. And that just reminds me of something that Dr. Oy was saying in our pre-event prep. And maybe you can follow up with that or go off of that, Dr. Oy. But you were saying something about how there are such low rates of high school graduation and college attendance, but from immigrants and refugees, but also first and second generation Asian Americans as well.
Yeah, so the current, we have to acknowledge our social media and how they position us against each other, right? So while people understand that there has been a lack of solidarity because we don't write about the solidarity, we don't write about the Grace Lee Boggs, the Yuri Kochiyama, we don't write the fact that MLK was inspired by Gandhi, right? We don't write that Thich Nhat Hanh was talking to MLK about Vietnam, right? Those are the things that have been doing, or Larry Italong when he was doing the Grape Farmers Workers, right, with Cesar Chavez. All of that has been happening within our community, but we don't see it because it doesn't get sensationalized. It doesn't meet the purpose of white supremacist models that is pitting, right? Because everyone is fighting for the same piece of pie, right? And so when they look at the piece of pie, we're only going to look for the pieces that fit our narrative. And so when the American Pew study came out in 2012, the rising of the Asian Americans, they only looked at the top 6. Right, the top 6 categories where it says Indians, 72% of them have bachelor's degree if you're 25 and above. They don't want to focus on the Southeast Asian. The Bhutanese are at 9%, right? The Southeast Asians are at 10 to 12 to 13% who are graduating, right? Because what they will tell you about is that pull yourself up from your bootstrap, right? The ones that is about meritocracy and the individuals who are fitting the narrative that they want you to follow. And so when we talk about the anti-Asian hate crimes, we're going to talk about the Black assailants of our Asian families, right? Not about how people actually came out and did community watch togethers. When we talk about George Floyd dying, it's his anniversary, no one talks about Angelo Quinto, right? He was also kneed for 5 minutes by the Antioch, California, right? So he died. His family members called because he had a mental health crisis, and the police came. He didn't de-escalate him, right? But nobody learns about that. And that happened in February, right, of 2021. And so this is that narrative. This fits into their strategy. And so if we have these communities who are struggling, we're not going to talk about that because it doesn't fit our narrative. And so let's talk about this other group of people.
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like this is such a powerful closing for us because I think really it's, your joy is my joy, right? Your hurt is my hurt. I think your humanity is my humanity. And I think if we could just sort of bottle that up, that we are in this for the common good together. I don't think it matters if we're Asians or, Americans or not. I think it's just our collective humanity is what we should be focusing on, at least from my perspective. And you've just brought such a depth of knowledge, of passion, and power to this conversation. And for those of you in the audience, we just want to thank you for joining us. I know probably the model minority myth of us being quiet and sort of heads down. I'm sure these folks have shared a little bit of a different view. And I'm just so grateful. We will not put the onus of responsibility for you to change the world on your shoulders. We will do that right with you, but we're going to maybe put you out in front because it's a lot easier. And for those folks who are my age and older, I want you to know that the level of courage that you show every day by doing what you do and sharing what you share gives my generation and the older generation a little bit of courage as well. And I want you to know that it's very important that you keep doing what you do and having that direct conversation. Dipshika, when you talked about, I've changed my family conversation, now they can do it on their own. Like, no, there you go ahead, have those hard conversations. Just thank you. And I think we have a feeling that you will all be coming up on our radar in years to come as well as you share your gifts with the world. And we're so very, very grateful. And for the audience, this session will be recorded and will be posted. And we are just very excited to have this fire in your lives and to our hearts. And so with that, one last piece, Jasmine, if you do get an opportunity to talk to Dr. Keogh at Stanford, he's a pretty big ball of fire too. So please tell him we said hello as well. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for making the time, and in just an allyship and in heart to heart, we appreciate every one of you for being with us, and we're grateful. So thank you.